President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about the budget agreement that's before the United States Senate. We had a vote today on moving ahead to that legislation, and I supported that movement, the cloture vote. And I supported the cloture vote and will support the underlying budget agreement because it does take modest steps to reduce the deficit, does so without raising taxes. It also relieves some of the sequester's worst impact on our national security. And it also prevents another government shutdown next month, but also next year. I also support it because it's time for us to have a budget around here. And we have not had a budget for 4 years. It will enable us to begin the process of having appropriations bills again. And in the appropriations process, of course, you have oversight over the federal departments and agencies, and you prioritize spending, which is really important. Among other things, this will give us the opportunity to root out some of the waste and fraud and actually determine what programs are working and not working to be able to use the power of the purse that Congress has to help be sure that taxpayer funds are being used efficiently and effectively. As members know here, this agreement was the culmination of what's called a budget conference committee between the House and the Senate. So it was Democrats and Republicans, but also the House and Senate coming together. That has not happened in 4 years. So we haven't had a budget in 4 years. We haven't had a budget conference in 4 years. And you think about that. Is it any wonder that during those 4 years, Congress has racked up historic debts and deficits? The deficits of the past 4 years have been the largest deficits in the history of our country. And one reason is we haven't had the discipline that comes with having a budget and being sure that there is some accountability for the spending. We haven't made the hard choices that our constituents have to make every day. How much to spend, what to spend it on, that's what a budget is supposed to do. Now, this budget agreement that will be voted on this week is far from perfect. There are a lot of things I don't like about it. In fact, I just supported the attempt to amend it here on the floor of the Senate to improve it. But I do believe that with a divided Congress, Republicans in charge in the House, Democrats in charge in the Senate, it was the best we could hope for. No tax increases, as the Democrats wanted. We just heard from one of my colleagues talking about more taxes needed, but no tax increases in this budget agreement. Actual deficit reduction, although I will acknowledge the deficit reduction is way too small. It's about $22 billion in deficit reduction over 10 years compared to existing law. It does provide some sequester relief for the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense was facing across-the-board sequester cuts, which are kind of arbitrary across-the-board cuts of about $20 billion, starting on January 15th and over the next few months. This relief is very important to our military. We've heard from them. It's important to our readiness. It's important to our troops. It's important to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and other bases around the country. It's important to our warfighters who around the globe tonight are putting their lives on the line for us. So I think that sequester relief for the Department of Defense that's in this budget agreement was important. While this might be the best 2-year budget agreement that is imaginable in a time of divided government like we have, with all of the dysfunction here in this town, it is certainly not the comprehensive agreement that the American people deserve. Through this agreement, Congress has now accomplished really the bare minimum of what the American people should be able to expect from Congress. After all, Congress does have, as I said earlier, the power of the purse. That's in the Constitution. Every dime has to be appropriated by the United States Congress. We should be the ones determining how taxpayer dollars are spent. You certainly need a budget. There are some who took to the floor today and will tomorrow, I'm sure, who are going to say this is a great budget agreement. It's a sign of how Washington can work, how things get done, how we can come together to fix a problem. Fair enough. We avoided a government shutdown. And yes, we're not going to gut national security. And yes, we will have a small deficit reduction, again, about $22 billion. But let's be honest about the opportunity that Congress missed this week with this budget agreement. When it comes to the real, very real budget and fiscal problems we face as a country, when it comes to the mandatory spending, that's the 2/3 of the budget that's on autopilot. That's the part that's driving our country toward bankruptcy. threatening to undermine really important vital programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We've done nothing in this budget agreement, nothing on that side of the ledger. We've kicked the can down the road one more time, missed the opportunity. And as we all know, unless we address these fiscal problems, the day of reckoning is coming. This is a pie chart of federal spending that will kind of show you where we are relative to 1965 when mandatory spending, this is the part again that Congress does not appropriate every year, it's on autopilot, was 34% of the budget. Defense 43, domestic discretionary 23%. Here's where we are today. Mandatory spending 66% of the budget, from 34% to 66%. And remember, this is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, also interest on the debt. By the way, defense spending has gone from 43% down to 18%. And yet the sequester takes most of the savings disproportionately out of defense, which is one reason this budget agreement was needed. So we've seen a big growth in the mandatory spending. And by the way, over the next 10 years, it goes from 66% to 76%. What does that mean? That means it crowds out discretionary spending. Defense spending, research spending, education spending, infrastructure spending, that's what's happening. So our deficits are going to record highs over the coming couple of decades, and mandatory spending is exploding, and it's squeezing the other spending in our budget. Over the next decade, the federal government is going to collect revenue of about $40 trillion, spend about $46 trillion, run a deficit of $6.3 trillion. Over the next 10 years, another $6.3 trillion on top of the $17 trillion debt. In that 10th year, by the way, 2023, the best case scenario has a projected deficit, annual deficit, of nearly $1 trillion, $895 billion for 1 year. And by the way, that assumes no wars. It assumes a decade of prosperity. It assumes 10 years of historically low interest rates. Quite a rosy scenario. If any of these factors fall through, things could be much, much worse, well over $1 trillion. And this is not a problem that can be solved by just cutting discretionary spending. Over the next 10 years, Washington will spend more than $22 trillion on these vital programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. If we were to cut our defense budget over the next decade all the way down to zero, have no defense spending at all, zero, we could pay for just 1/4 of that cost, of the $22 trillion. If we removed every penny of potentially identifiable waste in government, which we should do, by the way, and that's why we need to get back to appropriations, but if we did that, if we removed every penny of potentially identifiable waste in government, we could pay for less than 10% of this exploding cost on the mandatory side. If we pulled out of Iraq and Afghanistan today, ended all bailouts and corporate welfare, reversed the tax cuts for all Americans making less than $450,000 a year that we kept as part of the fiscal cliff agreement, if we repealed Obamacare altogether, if we did all those things, we'd cover just 20% of the cost of those programs, this $22 trillion. In other words, even if we wanted to try to do it by cutting this spending, we couldn't do it because there's not enough money in that part of the budget. So it's not just a matter of choosing spending priorities. And it's certainly not a matter of raising taxes. My colleague earlier talked about how we need to raise more taxes for different things, and I understand a lot of people are saying that. But let's be honest about this. It's a bad idea at a time of a weak economy to raise taxes anyway. Plus, over the next decade, you know what happens on taxes? Over the next decade, we're told by the Congressional Budget Office, taxes will be, as a percent of the economy, which is the way you ought to look at it, economists tell us, this will be at historically high levels. Historically high levels. So the economy is already weak. Tax revenues are headed toward their highest sustained levels in history. And when it comes to taxes, there's an alternative, which is let's reform the tax code. What we should be doing is restraining spending, reforming these vital but unsustainable programs, and also raising more revenue through growth and economic growth can come through tax reform. That tax reform gives the economy a shot in the arm. It helps bring back the jobs. It increases revenue through growth, and that's why we need both entitlement reform and tax reform. The issue of entitlement reform is a tough one politically, and a lot of members of Congress are hesitant to touch it. It's called the third rail of American politics. That's the electrified rail in the New York subway system, where if you touch it, you're electrified. Let's start small. How about means testing of Medicare? This could be a first step in the right direction. Under Medicare, the average two-earner couple retiring today pays $119,000 in lifetime Medicare taxes and yet receives $350,000 in lifetime Medicare benefits. So $1 of taxes for $3 of benefits. That's how Medicare works. That's for the typical family in Ohio or around the country. When you multiply this by 77 million retiring baby boomers, you can see why we have a totally unsustainable program, because not enough money goes in to be able to pay for the benefits coming out. Providing $3 in benefits under Medicare for every $1 paid in taxes for low-income seniors is one thing. We want to be sure that low-income seniors are taken care of. For the most part in their working years, those folks probably didn't earn enough income to pay large Medicare taxes. And the program is designed to ensure that they do receive the medical coverage they would not otherwise get. But should upper-income seniors who are on Medicare receive benefits that far exceed what they pay into the system? That's what happens now. Is that fair? I don't think so when the program's going bankrupt, when our kids and grandkids are facing massive tax increases to pay for a problem that we all foresee and yet fail to correct. By the way, I tried in this latest budget agreement to say on the mandatory side of the ledger, why don't we deal with means testing of Medicare? That would have provided enough revenue to provide the relief on sequester. We wouldn't be doing things like TSA fees, wouldn't be doing things like reducing the benefits for our military. It was rejected. It was rejected. I talked to a number of Democrats about it who said we just can't touch that. We can't touch even means testing of Medicare without raising taxes. So in essence, raising taxes on the wealthy is necessary to reduce benefits for the wealthy. That's the point we're at. That's how tough it is. That's why we need a new approach. And that's why we need some leadership here in the House, the Senate, but also at the White House. We need a president willing to help us on this, to talk about it. Have you ever heard the president talk about the fact that there is $3 of benefits coming from Medicare for every dollar you put in? Have you heard him talk about the fact that entitlements are going to otherwise bankrupt the country? We need a little straight talk and an honest dialogue about this. If we do nothing, as we have done with this budget agreement before the Senate, with regard to mandatory spending, entitlement spending, and as we've done time and time again, the Social Security Disability Trust Fund will go bankrupt in 2016, a couple years from now. Medicare will follow in 2026. And again, every year, much more being paid out than being paid in. Social Security, already in a cash deficit, meaning there's more money coming out in terms of benefits than there is payroll taxes going in every year. But it will collapse, the trust fund will collapse in 2035. Medicaid has no trust fund, so it won't go bankrupt itself. It'll just continue to grow at unsustainable levels, helping to bankrupt the country, but also, in that case, it may take the states down with it. As states will tell you, it's generally their largest and fastest growing expense, is Medicaid. So these are issues that we must address. On the floor of this chamber, we often talk about the next generation. We hear speeches about protecting the elderly and ensuring every American gets the benefit of the bargain that was made when Social Security and Medicare came into being. I agree. But to do that, we need to improve and preserve these programs. And we need to stop blaming one another for what happened because, frankly, Republicans and Democrats alike are responsible for this. We have done one thing that is truly bipartisan in the last few decades, and that is we have overspent and we have overpromised, Republicans and Democrats alike. Because we helped create this mess together, we've got to work together to resolve it. With this vote on the budget this week, another budget crisis has passed, and that's good. We're on the road to avoiding another government shutdown in January and again next year. That's the most basic job of government, and I think that's good. And we got a little bit of deficit reduction, and we didn't raise taxes on a weak economy. But we need to aim higher. Perhaps in the context of the debt limit debate that's coming up in a matter of only a few months, we can get more serious about the underlying problem. Because it's that underlying problem that's driving our future deficits. We all know that. We all agree on that. We all know it has to be fixed. So let's do it this coming year. We've seen how divided government can achieve something important but small. That's what happens with this budget agreement this week. In 2014, next year, let's see how divided government can achieve something big and critical to economic growth and jobs and to the future of our children and grandchildren. That's our solemn responsibility here in the United States Congress, to ensure that we're leaving a better world to future generations. We cannot do this if we do not address this fiscal crisis. Mr. President, I yield back my time, and I note there's an absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, we don't expect any more legislative work this evening in the U.S. Senate. Earlier today, members agreed to advance to a final vote the federal budget agreement, 67 to 33. A final vote on that budget agreement is likely on Wednesday. Of course, the House passed its version last Thursday. Also tomorrow in the Senate, they'll work on the 2014 Defense Authorization Bill, that's $625 billion. Pentagon's bill for Pentagon programs and policy. And while this quorum call continues, we're going to bring you a conversation from this morning's Washington Journal looking at federal regulations.
On the topic of the cost and benefits of federal regulations. Joining us, former U.S. Senator Blanche Lincoln, Democrat from Arkansas, served in the Senate from 1999 to 2011, and now is the chair of the Small Business for Sensible Regulations. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining us, Robert Weissman of Public Citizen, and serves as their president. Welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
To get the discussion started, we've kind of titled this the cost and benefits of regulation. So let me ask both of you. Senator, starting with you, Senator Lincoln, are there costs or benefits to regulation?
Absolutely, and I'll be willing to bet you that Robert and I agree probably on a lot more than we disagree on. But any regulation is going to have a cost, and it's going to have a benefit, hopefully. But the cost is sometimes small, and sometimes it's large. The point that we are trying to make is that we want to see, we want greater transparency in terms of what those costs are and what those benefits are. And we want real data to be able to see what that is all about.
What goes into determining the cost and benefit? Well, what would you say goes into factoring in if it's a cost or a benefit?
Well, I think everything should. I mean, without a doubt, I know that all of the, or certainly way over the majority of the small businesses that we poll and talk to, you know, they want safer working conditions, they want to cleaner air and clean water, but they also want to be heard and understood about how regulations affect them as small businesses, and what are the costs to them, whether it's a cost out of their pocket, whether it's a cost in terms of jobs that they could be creating or that they have to lose because they've got to meet a regulation. You know, what are the benefits? Are the benefits outweighing the cost in terms of what it's costing them as a small business person in the community and in the economy at large?
Mr. Weissman.
Well, it's absolutely true. There are costs and benefits to regulation. I think regulation has been really vital in making our country as strong as it is. The air we breathe is cleaner, the food we eat is safer, the water we drink safer, workplaces are safer. We've got rid of child labor all through regulation. We do know something about the costs and benefits of regulation. The White House does an annual study that looks back over the previous 10 years and looks at both the costs and benefits of regulation. And even if you use that figure, which I think is cramped because it doesn't take into account some non-monetary benefits and I think overestimates the costs, benefits outweigh the costs by as much as 10 to 1. That's both true for the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And it turns out that regulators actually are really sensitive to the costs and the impact on the economy of anything they might do. Overly sensitive sometimes, I think. Particularly concerned about small business. And they don't act rashly. They just don't. And there's, in every single rule you look at, basically, it has any significant impact on the economy. Even through this narrow kind of cost accounting, the benefits dramatically outweigh the costs.
Is there a sense, maybe sometimes reflected by small business, that there's too much regulation from this administration?
Well, there certainly is a sense by the small business lobby, and especially by the big business lobby for whom the small business lobby sometimes works. I don't think it's objectively true. Actually, the level of regulation from this administration is not dramatically different than even the previous administration. It is somewhat more, in part because so much was undone during the Bush administration, and also partly because of the Wall Street Reform Act and all the rules that are required out of that, and then the Health Care Act and all the rules required out of that. But by and large, we have not seen as much of a surge in regulation as you might think, actually not nearly as much as many of us would hope to see. There's too much that needs to be done that this administration has not yet got to on the regulatory front.
Senator Lincoln, how would you respond to the claims as far as the level of regulations from this administration and the past one as well?
Well, I think, first of all, Robert's right. We're not about doing away with regulations or agencies. We think that regulations are a good thing. We just think that government needs to be smarter about them. And I do think that since 2006, you have seen a larger increase in regulations. You've got about 3,300 pending new regulations in the pipeline right now. And so what I would say is that, you know, the uncertainty of what's going to come out of this large number of regulations, which I think we have seen an increase. There's no doubt about that. But again, we're not saying that we don't want regulations. What we're saying was we want government to act smarter about them. And there are definitely costs, and there are benefits. And I think there are times when we have to determine whether or not those benefits outweigh the cost. And we need to use everything in terms of determining that cost, not just what it costs to the pocketbook of that small business person, but what does it mean to our economy overall in terms of jobs. We are not growing enough jobs to sustain the growth in our economy right now.
And if part of that's because of regulation?
I think some of it is. I'm not saying all of it is. I'm just saying some of it is. And particularly since small business are really our largest job creators, particularly non-government jobs. And we want to empower them to be able to not only comply and help us reach all the great things that Robert mentioned. You know, the fact that we are a country that has cleaner air and cleaner water, safer working conditions, and a whole host of other things that we've done because of, you know, government working with industries and businesses. But I think we have lost a little bit of that in terms of empowering our small businesses to be able to work with government. That's why we would like to see more transparency in the data that is used to determine that cost benefit. And that we would have a seat at the table for small businesses to be able to talk about their unique experiences of having to deal with compliance. And that's really what it's about, is compliance. It's having government smarter so that it will empower small businesses and work with them to meet that regulatory compliance that's out there. And that way, I think both have a vision of what is necessary, both government and those that are regulating, as well as the small businesses who desperately want to be good stewards not only of the environment and of the workplace, but of their communities and the economy.
Mr. Weissman, she speaks of transparency, seat at the table. When it comes to these things, how would you respond, and does this administration do that?
Yeah, well, I think there is a strong link between regulation and the state of the economy, but it's a little bit different than the Senator suggested. The reason our economy is suffering now is directly a result of the 2008 financial crash and the housing bubble. That crisis is entirely or largely due to a whole series of non-regulation, deregulation efforts, enforcement failures. So the Federal Reserve didn't crack down on the banks, didn't monitor Wall Street, didn't deal with a housing bubble. Whole series of rules have been rolled back, let Wall Street get out of control, and we're all suffering. So the unemployment crisis we suffer from right now, the lack of growth in the economy we suffer from right now, is a direct result of too little regulation. When it comes to small business having a seat at the table, they do. There are special rules that require, special laws that require small business to have an extra bite at the apple before rules are promulgated. There's amazing transparency about the cost estimates for any significant rule that's put forward. So that's not an Obama administration position. That's gone back way before that. But small business is very amply represented in the regulatory process, and there is high degree of transparency in terms of cost. Now, there are problems about transparency, but it's mostly on the other side and about how business gets to intervene in the process and stop rules from moving forward.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a special agency at the White House which reviews all significant regulations before they go forward. And that agency never makes rules stronger. It never speeds them along. It only slows them down and weakens them. And there's been special access for big business to that agency, which has been a channel for both the agency and the White House itself to slow the regulatory process. And we've seen that time and time again, whether it's environmental rules, rules about workplace safety, rules about preventing children from getting run over and back over incidents, and on down the list.
Our guests on to talk about the costs and benefits of federal regulation. You've heard their perspectives, and now you have a chance to talk to them and ask them questions about this topic as well. Here's how you can do so this morning. For Republicans, it's 202-585-3881. For Democrats, 202-585-3880. And for Independents, 202-585-3882. You can tweet us a question or comment at C-SPAN WJ. You can also email us as well at journal@cspan.org. Both of you, I think, at one time mentioned the financial industry and what happened back then. Just to give an example, and maybe this is a wrong one, I don't know, but the Dodd-Frank Act, which oversees the financial services industry. A lot of regulations put into place. At last count, though, about only 40% of those regulations actually, made it into the process of being official and being on the books. Why does it take so long to get these type of regulations to the point where they're actually being done? Robert Weissman.
Well, their agencies don't have enough resources to do what they need to do, but they're also facing an enormous pushback from Wall Street. So Wall Street fights the adoption of the Dodd-Frank law in Congress, wins some, loses some, but they never stop. So then they take the fight on into the agencies. And there, the public interest representation, which is already weak in Congress as compared to the industry, is much weaker. So you see agencies meeting with industry officials about 10 times as often or more, sometimes 100 times as often as they're meeting with public interest representatives. And it's slowed the agency process down. We're a weaker country for it. The rules that are required by Dodd-Frank will make us stronger. And as you say, even 3 years after passage of the law, we've only got about half of them done, maybe even less.
Senator Lincoln?
Well, clearly, there was a huge need for transparency and accountability in the financial markets. And Dodd-Frank, we tried very hard to put into Dodd-Frank both the necessary legal language, but also the flexibility for regulators. And that's a fine line for legislators because, you kind of go through phases on Capitol Hill where people think that legislators are micromanaging, that they're not allowing, the regulatory process to take part in what needs to happen as laws are formed and put on the books. And then sometimes it's, there's too much, leeway given to the regulators and agencies. But I think that in Dodd-Frank, we tried to make very clear what we were trying to do in terms of creating greater transparency and accountability in Dodd-Frank, and particularly on Wall Street, and handing some of that over to regulators. I think that, they've done some of what needs to be done. I think that clearly there's more to be done in terms of the rules and regs that need to come out of there.
Are you surprised by a 40% application of rules and regulations?
No.
Because?
Well, because regulators and most of these things take forever. I think it's important to have peer review, and I think it's important to have the input of Wall Street. That doesn't mean that they need to write the regs, but they definitely have to have input in terms of their knowledge of what it's going to do to the markets, as well as what it's going to do to the global economy and the global markets. I think that's critically important. I was, reaching out to our counterparts in other countries. That was something that we did as legislators when we were writing, and certainly we've seen some of that from the regulators. I think that's an important point, too. We're no longer insular. We're not just our own economy. We are working within the confines of a global economy, and we need to work with those individuals globally.
Let's take a call. I'll let you respond to that if you wish. Ron from Mount Vernon, Ohio, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to comment about, we have one party that tries to put in decent regulation, and when they get it passed, when they get, whatever regulation it is, they get it passed, then the other side of the aisle is trying to not fund it. They just try and figure out a way so it passed, and it's law, but we don't have to fund it. You can see that in many different ways. That's one reason why I, after the first Clinton White House, I decided to change my colors. To just try and not look for common ground, and looking to just make the other party look bad.
Mr. Weissman.
Yeah, I think it has been a problem that the Republican Party, unfortunately, in the last few years has taken up the idea that regulation is just devastating, and passed, at least in the House, a whole series of anti-regulatory bills, and also, as you said, really threatened the funding of the agencies to enable them to carry out rules that have been adopted, the laws that have been passed, really making it so they can't enforce the law. If I could comment on the previous discussion, one of the rules that was required in Dodd-Frank was an obligation on the Securities and Exchange Commission to require publicly traded companies to disclose, so this is a transparency measure, to disclose the ratio of pay between
Call
CEOs.
the quorum be terminated.
Without
Are
objection.
we in a pre-morning business now?
The senator is correct.
I ask unanimous consent the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 947, and we now proceed to that matter.
The clerk will report.
S. 947, a bill to ensure access to certain information for financial service industry regulators and for other purposes.
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read 3 times passed. Motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent we now proceed to S. 1847.
The clerk will report.
S. 1847, a bill to provide for the redesignation of the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies as the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read 3 times passed. Motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there are 2 bills at the desk due for first reading, I'm told.
The clerk will read the title of the bills for the first time.
S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes. S. 1846, a bill to delay the implementation of certain provisions of the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 and for other purposes.
I now ask for second reading, but to both of these I object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bills will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent the Environment and Public Works Committee be discharged from further activity on H.R. 2251 and that we now proceed to its consideration and the consideration of H.R. 185, which was received by the House and is at the desk.
Is there objection?
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measures en bloc.
Be read 3 times, passed, and blocked. Motion reconsider be considered made, laid on the table to both these measures, and there be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day, it adjourn till 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, December 18th. Following the prayer and pledge, morning hour be deemed expired. Journal proceedings be approved to date. Time for the 2 leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. And following any leader remarks, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to concur in the House message to accompany H.J. Res. 59. Further, that all time during adjournment count post-closure on the motion to concur.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we hope votes are possible throughout the day tomorrow. Senators will be notified when they're scheduled. There's no further business to come before the Senate. I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The Senate's gavelled out, but earlier today, members advanced the federal budget agreement by a 67-33 vote. That agreement passed the House last week. A final vote's expected Wednesday in the Senate. Also tomorrow, work on 2014 defense programs and policy, which authorizes $625 billion for Pentagon programs. And Majority Leader Reese said he'd like to debate and confirm some judicial and executive nominations, including Janet Yellen's nomination to be chairman of the Federal Reserve. Follow the Senate live here on C-SPAN 2 when members gavel back in.